Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutun.
Welcome to Consider This. Tonight on the show, we're going to be taking a closer look at the reason for this soon-to-be-launched book titled Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope in Malaysia Baru. Our guests tonight, we have Kian Wong, who's the editor of the book. He's also working on a project at the Southeast Asian Centre at the University of Sydney. And Tashni Sukumaran, who contributed a piece to the book titled The Amazing Race for Malaysia Across the World. She's also the Malaysian correspondent for South China Morning Post. Guys, welcome to the show. Good to have you here. Now, again, I said I'd like to start with, I guess, the raison d'etre for this book. Why put this book together, Kian?
Well, it sort of came about partly from the series I was editor of last year on Malaysia, on a historic year for the Australian National University's Southeast Asia site, New Mandala. And from that, however, I think it seemed very apparent and important, at least for me as a journalist. And I think that Malaysians tend not to document their own histories very well. And I think we had a very historic moment last year in which there were a whole bunch of books and other things coming out now. And one thing I found a bit problematic was that the great majority of them were what some people might call armchair punditry and a lot of opinions, but very little factual reporting and reportage on the ground, I thought. And also, I think the other thing that wasn't privileged very much was really discussions about policy and the issues and the grappling with actually very difficult problems of policy and reform. So that's partly what the book is about.
Okay.
Right. So you feel a gap that you think exists in the literature that's been produced following the this power shift, you might want to call it. The question is, you know, what can people expect, and who were you looking to fill that gap along with you? Because you have a huge range of individuals who contribute to this book, and Tashni, because you're one of them. Tell us, what were you looking for when you went out and looked for, when you were commissioning chapters for the book?
Some of it was already commissioned last year when I was editing the series. Some of them are fresh commissions, and some of them are celebrations of actually what I thought were the best reportage during the very hectic campaign that was published in Malaysia Kini by a lot of young journalists who did great work, I thought, and deserved to be celebrated and marked, you know, in some way. And I thought it was really good for us to have this document of some sort. I didn't think of it as a book, but on the other hand, I thought, you know, we should take ourselves a bit more seriously. And I think we also, as Malaysians, you know, we always are quite, what do you call it, casual and perhaps overly modest. And I think last year, I mean, I look at it from outside, from a Southeast Asian perspective, with other Southeast Asianists, you know, from abroad. And Malaysia was an amazing story for those who might believe in democracy, and also in what, you know, extraordinary things that ordinary people can do. And it's very rare to have what do you call it, a sort of change of regime or change of government through the ballot box.
That's right. We made voting sexy again.
It's very rare. It's very rare.
Democracy sexy again, perhaps?
Yeah.
Tashni, I want to ask you about your contribution to the book. So Ken said that this is really about fact-based reporting, right? Documenting what happened factually during GE14. What was your piece about? So titled The Amazing Race for Malaysia, right? Across the world.
So when elections were happening, I was actually in the UK doing my master's, and a lot of us, all the students there, hadn't received our postal vote yet.
Right.
And, or even if we did, we received it so close to date, we weren't sure we would be able to send it back in time. And I remember we were looking at FedEx and DHL and how expensive it would be to get it back within, what, 48 hours. And it just happened quite organically. All these Malaysians who, going back, said, I'll carry the ballots for other Malaysians. We met on social media, through Facebook, through WhatsApp, and we all sort of congregated at different places. You know, I think in London it was a few of the parks. I think similar things happened in Australia and New Zealand.
People met in airports,
strangers. In airports, yeah.
Strangers and pilots taking
so,
things home.
Exactly, and it was just really amazing how everyone was so trusting and so friendly.
What was your experience? When did you get the the ballot paper?
So I got mine late as well.
Ooh.
But because of these Malaysians who are going back, we managed to find somebody, and we all met, I think, Hyde Park or St. James, and gave them the ballot, and then they took it back. They stopped at KL Central. Everyone's parents or siblings went to KL Central, collected the ballots, and then continued on their drive back.
Right.
So I think mine arrived like the day of or just the day before.
So, I mean, these were the feel-good stories that were circulating around that time. But how do you balance the descriptive and the analytical? Kian, you have an overall sense. You were commissioning pieces, or you were picking up on already published work and thinking, what is the balance between the analytical and the descriptive in this collection?
Well, I think we try and mix it, again, with a lot of data that's coming out from all sorts of places, some of it unreliable data as well, I must point out.
Unreliable?
Yes, well, contentious, right? And it's good to have, I think, to me, trustworthy, credible analysts to go through it. For instance, the Malaysian economist based in Singapore, Lee Hock Wan, has a wonderful piece, really, about, how this economy is being reframed post-NEP, post-kleptocracy, all that. So I think that's very interesting. Another contentious one, which makes a polemic, but I feel based on evidence out there, by Professor James Chin from the Asia Institute in University of Tasmania, in which he argues we have to be very careful not to have a secessionist movement like the Catalans in Spain over Sabah and Sarawak. And I think these are worthwhile policy issues that we need to think and grapple with and take it seriously.
So you said, okay, so there are contentious pieces in the book, but you said that you wanted to stay away from contentious data. What were you referencing?
Well,
in that
I think this might be a bit of an in-joke amongst those of us who dwell in the economics area. Speaking as a not really economist myself, but I somehow hang out with a lot of economists who have a lot of problem in the region with rubbery figures. The stats departments tend to be weaponized for all sorts of governance. And Malaysia is not as bad as that, but we had a lot of problems during the previous government over what turned out to be rubbery figures over scandals like 1MDB.
Okay, well, we're going to come back and continue this conversation in just a couple of minutes. Make sure you don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here. Tonight we're looking at the soon-to-be-launched book titled Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope in Malaysia Baru. Really looking at documenting what happened in GE14 and beyond. We have the editor Kian Wong with us here and contributor Tashni Sukumaran on the show. And I just want to follow up with what Sharaad said about your piece, Tashni. It felt like it was a feel-good piece, right? So I just wanted to kind of think about the tone. So what's the tone of your piece? Was it celebratory? And Kian, overall, what was the tone that you're hoping to achieve with this book? Tash.
I mean, I think I was quite fortunate in that my piece was more of a feature, and I didn't have to do all the crazy campaign stuff that Malaysia Kini, for example, were doing here for like really ridiculous hours. So yeah, it was actually very celebratory. Obviously, there were people whose ballots came much later and couldn't vote, and it was quite a shame. But for all these Malaysians to be able to get together and have these impromptu gatherings and really find out the best in each other just for this.
It feels like a feel-good piece, like kind of rallying together. But was there anger and resentment at the process during the time?
Absolutely. A lot of people were really unhappy with the election commission at the time. I mean, I remember there was a protest even in London, where is my ballot? And that, I think, is reflected in the article.
Okay.
But there's also this emphasis on all these young Malaysians who have gone together and sort of circumvented these things, even though it shouldn't have been something they had to do.
Sure. And Ken, the overall tone of the book, did you, a lot of the books out there are really analytical, right, about GE14. What did you want to achieve with the tone of this book? Is it a feel-good book?
No, I wouldn't so much think of, we didn't really think of the tone, like I was saying before. I mean, for me, the point of the book was to document what was a historic moment in Malaysia's history. And, you know, Tasni's piece, for instance, is wonderful in that way on the deep reporting that happened, which is seldom done. I think there are a lot of feel-good moment pieces like that about, you know, Malaysians done well abroad and so on. And actually, to be fair, I think Tasni's piece is actually very straight, but very good reporting on a whole bunch of people across the world who were Malaysians, who clearly, you know, found this particular elections, you know, resonated with them. And I think were very angry, as many people were across the country when, you know, some of my pieces talked about what, you know, issues of so-called marwah, you know, issues of scandals and infamy, which they didn't want to be part of. And we try in the book, I think, to substantiate that with data and evidence that looks at, you know, aspects of the economy, of Islamism, of, you know, so-called race relations. And I think a lot of it, in fact, doesn't involve a lot of personalities, you know. I mean, we don't have the so-called icons of democracy and the opposition in there, actually, very much. We don't name them very much.
Why was it a conscious decision to kind of stay away from that?
It wasn't so much a conscious decision.
Sorry, Tash, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, you've got the ordinary voter, I suppose, more than,
Absolutely.
you know, a premier in waiting or
That's right.
the statesman who's come back.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I'd like to have a discussion about, you know, the kind of media coverage we've had for the new Malaysia, as it were. I want to ask you, Ken, though, you have this division. You have twilight, and it's followed by dawn, and then you have high noon, which obviously is a reference to that old
And 4 more years.
Western of a kind of. So what is it that you're building up? I mean, twilight, of course, vampires and something, right? And werewolves. That's a teen thing, but I'll leave that for a while. High noon interests me. What was the high noon? The high noon has the most contributions as a section, I think, if I count them correctly. Tell us why high noon.
High noon is where, you know, the campaign happened, right? That's where the
peak period
the
during
peaks, the standoff, right? And it was really capturing, you know, what happened in a very intense, 10, 12 days across the country. So I think we tried to, you know, we covered a fair bit of that. The 4 more years towards the end was really, those more reflective pieces and contributions where we attempt to peer into the near future.
Okay, so this time frame that you are, because you know the book is coming out quite a while after GE14.
Yeah.
So you're stretching it until post Malaysia Baru, right?
I think, you know, it's very easy, and I have many Malaysian friends, even analysts in Australia, for instance, who are very cynical about this Malaysia Baru. They spit it out, right? And I'm sure Tasni knows a lot more on that. She's done, you know, a lot of reporting since the GE14 period for the South China Morning Post, in depth on so-called Malaysia Baru. And I think it'd be interesting to see, you know, how we frame that. But I mean, my experience, for instance, of the first few years of the end of Suharto's Orde Baru in Indonesia was that it took 5-6 years to unravel a lot of that. And we're a year and a half in, and we haven't quite done it all yet.
I do want to ask you, and Tashni, you know, I mean, beyond the piece that you contributed to the collection, I mean, just your thoughts on this, you know, in understanding what happened over the general election, can we distill some lessons about what's happened since? Meaning that, you know, there's a lot of, what happened is contested. Some people think it was a revolution.
Sure.
Some people assume that, you know, their liberal agenda of feelings about what they wanted change to mean could be generalized across the country, right? From Lahad Datu down to Langkawi, it was all the same. I mean, for you as a journalist, especially covering out, how do you link that moment with what you see transpiring over the last 18 months?
I mean, actually, I think that's the difficulty, in that there was such a feel-good sort of momentum after the election. Everyone was so happy. And then once you set yourself up there, it's very easy to become disappointed, whether fairly or unfairly. And I think that's what people in the media, and even, of course, voters are struggling with now, that the growing pains of of democracy. And it does take 5 years. In some regimes, it takes longer. There's also the high chance that there will be a swing back.
A reversal.
Sure. I
Yeah.
mean, if you look even at our Southeast Asian neighbors, right? I mean, we're one of the few countries that sort of moved towards, I suppose, a more progressive administration. So I suppose telling people that these things take time, or seeing them come to terms with it after this election, has been the most jarring thing about Malaysia Baru.
A lot of people have, you know, especially recently, have sort of lost hope in Malaysia Baru, right? The expectation, as you said, the expectations were really high, and when they're not met, it's very easy to lose hope or to be disenchanted. And I guess I'm wondering, do you, is that legitimate? Is that loss of hope valid? What do you think, Daphne?
You're out there talking to them.
Yeah, I would say it depends on why you voted for Pakatan Harapan and what changes you want to see. So if you wanted like cost of living to be better and the economy to improve, that obviously will take time, especially if we take them at face value as to all the problems they said they've inherited. But on the other side, these are things I take from conversations with activists and lawyers and things like that. And they've said there are things that you can do, like abolishing the Sedition Act or not using SOSMA, which has been in the news a lot recently. So there's that dichotomy, I suppose. The question is, why are you not doing these things that on the surface looks like you could do quite easily?
Like low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Ken, what do you think? Do you think people have lost hope? Is that a valid feeling?
I suppose, because I don't think many people spend a lot of time grappling and wondering about how difficult governance is and how difficult it is actually to formulate policy that works. It's really hard work, and you're dealing with a bunch of novices in government, you know.
Are you personally still optimistic?
I think there is some progress, and I would be still cautiously optimistic because I would frame it in the context of a region where you've had these huge difficulties in our neighbors, and I don't think we're that badly off. I fully understand, however, you know, the sort of reporting that, for instance, Tashni has done about people aggrieved over rising poverty, joblessness, underemployment, really critical issues, not to mention the racialized religious. You know.
Sure.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and come back and continue this conversation on Consider This. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris with me, Sharaad Kutin. We're speaking to contributors and an editor of the soon-to-be launched book, Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope in Malaysia Baru. Ken, can you tell us very quickly when the book is expected out?
Publisher says before Christmas.
Before Christmas.
So
and all leading
in time
bookstores.
for presents.
Yes, of course. and more importantly, in some ways, because of the Australian National University's, you know, subsidy of this production of the book, Australia-wide.
Australia. So that's interesting. Is this book meant for an international audience? Because you said you wanted this to be, you know, documenting Malaysian history. It's meant for an international audience.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is with, you know, half of it, a weathered eye, looking at, you know, how to explain Malaysia and get away from what sometimes is the cliches.
Okay. So the contributors, very quickly, I guess, wrote this with an international audience in mind. And I think this is interesting because, Tashni, you are a correspondent for Foreign Press for South China Morning Post. When you're writing about Malaysia, thinking about an international audience, how do you frame the Malaysian story? What is it that an international community wants to understand about Malaysia?
Honestly, maybe because I've lived here for so long. It's actually...
You're a local correspondent.
Yeah. So that is actually one of the challenges I do have. And there's just so much history you have to distill, especially when it comes to things like race relations or political parties, right? So this guy, for example, deputy prime minister and then opposition leader and then in jail
so
and then in
much
jail again.
Context, right?
Yeah, and it's very difficult to sort of make that accessible to a regional audience. But what we have found is that people are interested. People actually really want to read about Malaysia.
And why? What is it? What's interesting about the Malaysian story?
Well, beyond the elections, which were landmark and came at a time where everywhere else, I would think, was shifting sort of to the right, I mean, Southeast Asia is a region that a lot of people are paying attention to. Our sort of outspokenness in things like the Belt and Road Initiative with China has also put us on many sort of maps. Things like Linus, our trade agreements. I mean, again, maybe I'm just too close to the situation, but I think it's a very interesting region.
And you managed to persuade your editor of this. I know the South Morning China Post did actually was very focused on doing coverage of the general election, and in fact, I think was seen as some of the best coverage from the foreign press that was coming from the South China Morning Post. So yeah, kudos to you. I mean, Kian, this is a very interesting project, and you combine the thick description, the reportage, analytical pieces that are evidence-based, but also speculative pieces. Today, as the new Malaysia is unfolding, what do you think we need to do? I mean, if you had this project, as it were, continue, volume 2, what would you start commissioning? What kind of stories?
I think it would be important that we continue to have serious-minded discussion about a country that we might all feel invested in, and not to be overly cynical and trivial. And that's what ends up happening. People get distracted over, you know, what in Australia might be called brain farts by various people. But, you know, I just don't think people take themselves seriously enough on what is actually a very critical moment. And in a regional context, and certainly in Australia, they see Southeast Asia as, in a sort of way, a buffer between the rising China and the sort of decline or fading out of a Western liberalism. And Southeast Asia is this wonderful melange, you know, of these types of different post-colonial values. And, you know, Malaysia has played a critical role, founding of ASEAN, right up till now, where it and Malaysia and Indonesia are really seen as the only two viable democracies in Southeast Asia now.
So just following up on Sharaad's question, I mean, if you're thinking about the second book, I'm still thinking the book is about to be launched, and you said it was it's meant for an international audience. Well, it's for all, but say a local reader is reading it. What is the conversation that you're hoping to spark with this book? You mentioned a bit earlier about this being, you know, about policy development. How would you like Malaysian readers to digest this?
Well, I think it's great that our book, for instance, unlike some other books out there, take Sabah and Sarawak seriously. I think that is a critical issue going forward, and the way that East Malaysia plays, to me, a fundamental role in how we define what a future Malaysia can be. I think that's very important. We tend to, you know, not take that too seriously. There is also the issue, I think, of, you know, religious politics, which is also in there. But also, I think, taking seriously people outside the metropolis, you know. People up and
outside down the Bangsa bubble and
outside the cities. And I think that's something, I think that's what some of the strength of the reportage was, that it wasn't just KL talking to itself.
Tashni, when you speak to your editors and you're kind of pitching stories, what are you looking at? Are the Borneo states, Sabah and Sarawak, important? Are they providing you a real sort of meaty grip on where the country's going?
I mean, Sabah and Sarawak are really important politically. They're kingmakers. They always will be. And I think even now they're sort of capitalizing of this position. But to be, and actually this is exactly what we try to avoid in the book, to be in KL, to be based in KL and not in KK or Miri or Kuching, and there's a huge gap. You can't report on Sabah Sarawak from KL. That's just the way it is.
You fly there often and to do the stories?
I actually would like to do a 2 or 3 week sort of fact-finding mission at some point.
Mission junket, lovely.
Actually, I would like to ask you that. I mean, you know, beyond reporting for South China Morning Post and, you know, the contribution that you have to this book, I'm wondering, what are you hoping Malaysians, the conversations that Malaysians are having and the missing narrative, what are you hoping that people understood or talked more about in Malaysia Baru?
I've always felt we've got these really great minds, like, you know, Huok On, who's in the book, and,
Yes.
and Professor Terence Gomez, and all these really, really brilliant Malaysians who write so well and want these ideas to come out. And I think now there's a bit more, people are a bit more receptive, people are a bit more interested. They want to know a bit more about policy,
Policy, yeah.
development, and governance, because it's never been a question
Oh my
before.
gosh, did we make policy sexy again?
I mean, I think what's interesting about the moment that you describe in the ballot run, as it were, is that in moments of crisis, Malaysians come together, use their creativity. There's so much energy, and then there's these long gaps, and it's the in between
Yes.
where we drop the ball, as it were,
Sure.
right? Where's the energy going into this moment that we saw in that moment? That's my question.
I mean, if I could answer that, I might be the next PM. No, I'm joking. Yeah, Malaysians are really good at taking things into their own hands when
Needed.
the need, when the need is dire. But there also seems to be sort of laissez-faire attitude to, like, all right, we've sorted it out, now it's your turn to fix it, and when you don't, I'll just get disappointed. But I mean, there have been things like the Tanjung Piai by-election, which showed sort of a shift, a swing in voters and things like that. So maybe Malaysians now are a bit more aware or ready or confident about showing that they're pissed off.
There you go. All right, well, that's all
Absolutely.
the time we have on the show today. Thank you so much for being on the show to discuss this book. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Curtin. This is all the time we have for this episode. We'll be back with you same time tomorrow. Signing off for tonight. Thank you for watching.